I'm going to get Ms. McHale to come on board. Good day, mate, and welcome to HRM Summit, Siobhan. Please take it away. Excellent. Super.
Mute, okay. So hopefully you can all see that screen. And in terms of moving it up and down, I presume I just click on the buttons to move it up and down. Is that correct?
I think it's okay. It is appearing all right with us. You can continue.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about moving to the next slide. That's all.
You see the list on the left? All the slides?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can click.
Got it. Okay, I don't use Zoom. I use Teams, so apologies.
No worries.
Okay.
No worries.
Okay. So thank you so much for tuning in today. My name is Siobhan. It's a strange name, but it's pronounced Siobhan, and I call myself an insider. So I have been the executive in charge of culture change in a series of multinational organizations, and culture change is my passion. I've also spent a decade as an outsider where I was a management consultant at Accenture and PwC, and I flew into workplaces across 4 continents and essentially started to see that some workplaces were very functional and they created high-performing workplaces, and then other workplaces were very dysfunctional and quite toxic. And I think what I started to notice was the difference between functional and dysfunctional workplaces. And that's what my book really is about. It's called The Insider's Guide to Culture Change, and it documents the 4 steps that you need to create a high performing workplace and a workplace that can deliver, grow and adapt. And I'd like to take you through some of those high level thoughts about what you can do to create a high performing workplace in my presentation today. So one of the first places I'd like to start is with Nokia. And I'm not sure whether many of you or all of you have heard of Nokia, but Nokia was the poster child for innovation in the late 1990s. And it was really the brand that was very well known globally for mobile phones. But by 2013, Nokia was a shadow of its former self and had been taken over by Microsoft. And you might say, well, was it a technology failure? Because obviously it's a technology company, but that would be the wrong assumption. Nokia failed for reasons of culture. It didn't have a collaborative culture within the organization in particular. So it had software engineers on the one hand who were being dominated by the hardware engineers who thought they were the kingpins. On the other hand, Apple had a culture where the software engineers and the hardware engineers were working closely together and collaborating to create iPhones that wowed customers and that essentially took the marketplace by storm. So this culture of collaboration between the software and the hardware engineers at Apple was basically sideswiped Nokia and led to its demise. And there were a number of other failures that Nokia executives, they failed to see what was on the horizon, which brings me to my next slide. If you're doing work on change, it's really important to step onto the bridge. As the captain of the ship, you have to spend time not only on the deck, but also on the bridge. So you can imagine standing on the bridge of the ship. What do you see from the bridge position? You can see the clouds on the horizon. You might see the storms emerging. You might see waves beginning to to rock the boat. You can see much more from the bridge than you would on the deck. And Nokia failed to see the storm clouds of Apple and Android in particular on the horizon. So they failed to take corrective action. And that action was about seeing the patterns within their culture that were causing them to be less agile than they needed to be in this disruptive environment. One of the places that I spent 7 years was at ANZ Bank in Melbourne, based in Melbourne, Australia. And this was a case study that actually drew the attention of Professor John Cotter, who is the change management guru at Harvard Business School. And he actually used this case study to teach MBA students about how to manage change. I was the executive in charge of culture change for a number of years at ANZ Bank. And when I first joined the bank, what I noticed was there was a very big difference between what was happening at head office and what was happening in the branches. When you walked into head office back in the early 2000s, what you noticed was very palatial offices. There were marble pillars, there were white, deep plush rugs on the floor, there were expensive paintings on the walls of the executive offices. Meanwhile, a few days later, I went to visit some of the 700 bank branches within the ANZ Bank. And what I noticed was that the paint was peeling from the walls, there were cracks on the ceiling, there were even in places worn out carpets, there were long queues of customers waiting impatiently for service and never seeming to get their questions answered. And what I started to see in the ANZ was that there were certain roles that people were taking up that were running the business. Head office was in role of order giver, and they were giving orders to the branches who were in role of order taker. So you had the order givers in head office making all the decisions and giving the directives, and branch people had stepped into the role of order taker, simply just waiting for the instructions and doing what they were told. And what I noticed was a pattern. Patterns are the hidden agreements between the different parts of the organization. And there was a pattern at ANZ where one part, head office, was blaming the branches and saying, you are to blame for the poor customer service. And in fact, ANZ had the poorest levels of customer satisfaction of all the big banks in Australia at the time when I joined the bank. And its profits were plummeting and its staff engagement was very low. 7 years later, we had transformed that situation and had one of the highest levels of engagement across any organization in the country. And it was the #1 bank on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index globally. Profits had doubled over that 7-year time frame and the share price had tripled. So financially it was much better off, engagement levels were high and customer service levels was high. And one of the reasons was we saw this pattern of blame that was going around and around and nobody was actually doing anything to fix the pattern. So what we did was we reframed the role. So the second step in culture change is to, first step is diagnose, but the second step is you've got to reframe the roles in order to bring about change. And why does reframing work? Reframing changes the mental map that you have about your role, and this can bring about faster change with less noise. Let me give you a simple example of a woman called Sarah Connors, who wakes up in the morning and greets her husband, Mark, good morning in role of wife. She goes down to the kitchen and gets her twins, her children, her twins ready for school, and she steps into role of mother. Later that day, she catches the train. She works in a New York hospital. She catches the train into her head. She's the head of department there. So she catches the train into work and she meets with some first year medical students and she steps into role of teacher. Later that morning, she catches up with her boss and she steps into role of negotiator to secure some funding for some imaging equipment for her department. that afternoon, a colleague comes into her office to ask for her opinion, a second opinion on a patient diagnosis, and she steps into role of advisor. That evening, she catches up with an old school pal and she steps into role of friend, and they exchange stories about what's been happening with their families. So in each of these roles, Sarah is the same authentic Sarah. She's still the same person in all of those roles of wife, mother, teacher, advisor, negotiator, and friend. But her behavior changes according to the mental map that she has of her role. So this is how we can change and bring about change faster and with less turbulence. We can change the mental map of the role rather than trying to change the person. So this is what we did at ANZ. We reframed the roles. So we restructured and reframed, put in a new operating model into the bank where we redefined the role of head office to be the support providers to the branches, enabling them to take up a role to be better able to support the branches who are stepping into a role of service provider to the customers. And we began to see a different pattern emerge across the bank, which was we worked together to serve the customer. And this pattern took a bit of work, but 7 years later, the ANZ Bank was the #1 bank globally on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. Its financials had turned around, its profit had turned around, its staff engagement had turned around. And part of that was this reframing the roles and changing the pattern of relating or the hidden agreement within the bank. And why are patterns important? Patterns show up everywhere in our lives. We see them in ecosystems. We see patterns in nature, whether it be the sun, the beautiful face of a sunflower. It could be the stars in the Milky Way. It could be the sand on the dunes in the Sahara Desert. We know that mathematical rules govern also show up in our families, and we can see that in some families there are dysfunctional patterns that are passed down through the generations. And we also know that some individuals can break out of these dysfunctional ways and they can create a more positive trajectory or path in their lives. So patterns also appear in workplaces, and another example of this pattern was in an organization called let's call it Build It Pro, which was a big infrastructure company where I was working for a number of years. And the CEO, Ben Harkness, was really worried about the fact that performance was dropping and margins were being eroded in the company in an increasingly competitive environment. And he asked me for help. And again, I took a step back and started to see what are the big patterns that are running the company. One of the big patterns that I noticed at Build It Pro was that managers had stepped into the role of nice guys or gals. So they were really motivated by being liked. That was a big value. They wanted to be liked. And they didn't give feedback to their employees because of that. And employees had stepped into the role of underachievers. So they were really not doing their best work because the pattern in the organization was being liked is more important than achieving. So the CEO was also co-creating this pattern because he had stepped into the role of Mr. Nice Guy, and his project managers were underachieving. So again, once Ben saw this pattern, he began to change his role to that of a performance manager. And he put his manager not into the role of the underachievers, but into the role of project managers. And a new pattern began to emerge that relationships and contract performance are important in this company. So those are some of the underpinnings in terms of getting culture right. And you've got to really give culture to the line managers to lead. This thing about it's HR's job to fix the culture seldom works out well. So busting that myth, ensuring that managers take up the role to lead the culture change in their parts of the business, and HR steps into its role to enable that change to happen faster and with less noise. The other myth we've got to bust is that culture is about documenting the values and behaviors, and that somehow if we document these values and behaviors, magically the culture change will happen. We all know that that is nonsense. So again, we've got to step into the role to bust that myth and to create the ability for our managers to be able to lead culture change faster and with less noise. So as I mentioned, if you're interested in this topic, you can find out more in my book, The Insider's Guide to Culture Change, where I talk about these 4 steps to changing workplace culture. The first of which is you've got to be able to step back on the balcony and diagnose what's really going on in the workplace. You've got to be able to see those patterns, which are sometimes quite difficult to detect. So it's a bit like in a family. You know, other people outside the family can see the patterns and the dysfunction within the family, and they can say that's quite dysfunctional, but people within the family find it harder to see those dysfunctional patterns. And the same is true in workplaces. There are hidden agreements of patterns that can often run our businesses, but we can become blind to them. So step number 1 in my 4-step solution is diagnose and see the patterns. The second one is reframe the roles. So you've got to be able to reframe the roles of the different parts of the organization in order to bring about faster change. You don't have to try and change somebody's personality or try and change who they are as people. Often we intervene at the level of, personality and try to change fundamentally who people are. I think that's the harder way to do things. I think it's much easier to reframe the role, just like we did at ANZ Bank, where we reframed the role of head office from order givers to support providers, and we reframed the role of the branches from order takers to support providers to the customer, or service providers to the customer. And that reframe led to an accelerated change, which we sustained over 7 years to produce a very different bank. So that's probably, in terms of my 20 minutes, I'm probably almost up, and I might pause there in order to take some questions.
Well, Siobhan, it was fantastic. To be honest, I've never been more serious than now to tell you. It was probably the best 15 minutes I have spent early morning, for me at least, in a long time to come.
Thank you.
For 2 reasons. One, culture, as you know more than I do, is a well bandied about topic, and everybody has something to say. One of the other things that does happen is, okay, I know culture is important. How do I make that happen? And I think in such a short space of time, you have just told us 2, if you will, case studies, which tells us exactly what you went about and how you went about doing that. And that's fantastic. To be honest, me as a CEO of a very small organization, not as big as Dulux Group or ANZ Bank, I think whatever you've said equally applies to small organizations. That's what I'm trying to say. Would you agree? Or is it geography specific? Is it
Yes.
site specific?
Absolutely correct. These patterns show up in small organizations and in very big organizations. You can have a small team where a pattern of the nice guy applies.
Across geographies, right?
Geographies also geographies. I've worked across 4 continents, and I've seen these dysfunctional patterns show up across 4 continents, including I spent some time in Bangalore, where ANZ offices there. And these patterns can show up, but you've got to be able to diagnose them, and it's never a one size fits all. It will always be unique. It's a bit like a family. The dysfunction or the pattern is unique to that family. So you've got to be able to go in there with your diagnostic tools and be able to see what's really going on. And I think once you see it, everybody goes, oh, wow, that's so obvious. But yet we were caught by it. We were blinded by it.
Right. Thanks. I have two. I have many questions, but I'll just ask them one at a time. You talked about that it took two things about implementing the culture change or the change in the way organizations perceive themselves. And you worked as an insider and as an outsider. Now, how important, or rather how difficult, how challenging it was for you to sort of listen or sort of get the management buy-in. I'm talking about the CEO level. Was he supportive of the recommendations you got?
Yes. This is such a great question. And I think many people in HR talk to me about, I have problems getting buy-in. And what I say to them is, you've got to stop framing culture in purely employee engagement or relationship terms, because you're going in talking about engagement, but what you need to do is talk about the business imperatives. So if the CEO is saying to you, I want to grow the business, or I want to create more innovation, or I want to expand, or I want to improve quality, or I've got all of these customer complaints, that is the agenda. So you say, right, okay, you want to improve customer satisfaction, or you want to grow the business. This is the type of culture that we need to grow the business.
Right.
So you don't come in with, oh, we do an engagement survey, because you just get people yawning and say, oh, well, here we go again, an engagement survey. And this is why my book is about how do you create a workplace that can deliver, grow, and adapt. I'm not talking just, employee engagement is a given. You've got to be able to talk to a CEO about, do you want to deliver? Yeah. Do you want to grow? Yeah. Do you want to adapt? Yes. And these are the things that I think we need to talk to executives about, speak their language, come in with tools that can enable the CEO to deliver on that agenda.
Right, great. Super. I personally have read your book, and I strongly recommend that it is read by most of the CEOs, because what you have done over there is you've linked the change or any culture change or any managing change initiative to the bottom line, which CEOs would love. So I would certainly recommend people read it. There are a lot of questions about the book, but that's for another day. I've got a very short question. You said to build and to implement and to sustain it took you 7 years. Would you break that up as to how long did it take for you to implement? What kind of message came, not from you, but from other powers to be, which said, now this has to happen? How long did the implementation part take, not the sustaining?
Yes, I think we reached a tipping point within 18 months. And I think it's really important that you get to that tipping point, because otherwise people begin to think, oh, this isn't really working. This is a bit of a fad. This is not a train I want to be catching. So you've got to nail that tipping point. And then the rest can be embedding and consolidating. But I would say if it's leader-led, not led by HR, then you're in with a chance. I tell the story in the book about how I joined an organization and the CFO shook my hand and said, good luck with changing the culture. And immediately I knew that I was in trouble, because it's not my job alone to change the culture. So the first conversation you have at the executive team and with the CEO is, whose role is it to do what during the change?
Fantastic. I'm absolutely inspired. Thank you so much. There are a couple of questions from the audience. What do you see are the challenges for creating a workplace that can grow, adapt, and deliver as well, with reference to COVID going forward?
With reference to going forward, I think within these pandemic times, you know, it's about the key stakeholder groups. You've got to examine and diagnose what are employees looking for in these COVID times. How do we meet their needs in a flexible way? What are shareholders looking for? They're looking for CEOs and executives to rebuild broken companies in some instances. What does the community need in post-COVID times, where we really need to think about locally made goods and sustainable ways of living? And what do customers want? You know, they're moving much faster than we can ever have imagined into a digital world, and expecting that digitally enabled capability. So I would say there's 4 lenses at least to look at things through.
Oh, excellent. There's somebody else who's talking about exactly the same topic, which is 4 lenses. We do have one more question, which again talks about what are the challenges for sustaining the good culture. I don't want to stretch you beyond your time, but quick answer, please.
The challenges for sustaining a good culture are that you've got to remain vigilant to the forces that may be working against the good culture. So you have to constantly be keeping an eye out for what is going on in the culture. What are you hearing? What are the whispers? Where is that culture being maybe compromised? And keep vigilant to that and step into the role. If you see that good culture being compromised, you need to step into a role that can shift that pattern very quickly.
Okay, fantastic. There's one more which says, how does culture align with strategy?
Yes. Well, Drucker said culture eats strategy for breakfast. And on one hand, I agree. But on the other hand, I always say that culture and strategy are not competitors. They are not competing with each other. The one is an enabler of the other. So culture enables strategy. If you've got a strategy, you always need to examine what is the culture that is going to fuel or enable my strategic intent. So for me, culture enables strategy. It doesn't eat it for breakfast.
That's fantastic. There's just another question which just says this. I'll leave it to your interpretation, please. What would it be like? That's the question.
What would it be like?
Yeah.
Would it be like if, what I wonder is what would it be like if all leaders knew how to create more adaptive and better cultures? What would it be like for all our constituents? Imagine if our leaders could create cultures that were better for our employees, better for our customers, better for our shareholders, and better for our communities. And that is really my passion. That is what has driven me to write this book. I don't need to write the book because I've got a good job as head of HR, but I kept on looking for where are the answers? Who are the people who need to tell this story? And I had to look back at myself and say, well, you've got to share what you know. So that's what's driven me to share and to step into my role, not just as a head of HR, but as a global educator.
All right, Siobhan, there's one thing is for sure. I think me and my team are going to hound you to have you back with us one of these days that is convenient to you in the near future. I'm totally inspired by what you have said in such a short space of time. I appreciate your time. I know Melbourne is going under lockdown today. I am very grateful for you being here and sharing this such fantastic, very laser-pointed insights with case studies and how you have done it. That's exactly what we seek in conferences like this, where give me actionable steps, because I'm a lay person. I don't have the time to, research.
Yes.
But you have greatly done that research. You've written a book, which is fantastic. And you have shared it, snippets of it in this 20 minutes. I look forward to having you with us in the future. And I thank you very, very much for being here.
Thank you.
And just want to say the Indian way of saying namaste, and thank you very much. Do take care.
Namaste. Namaste. Thank you. See ya.